Most people's relationship with debt is shaped by the context in which they first encountered it. Consumer debt, credit card balances, car loans, buy now, pay later arrangements for things that depreciated before the first payment cleared. And from that experience, debt becomes associated with a specific feeling: obligation, constraint, the weight of owing something to someone who has power over the terms, which makes it difficult to evaluate debt clearly as what it structurally is, rather than through the emotional residue of how it was first experienced. Debt is a financial instrument, not inherently good, not inherently destructive. An instrument with specific mechanical properties: a cost, the interest rate; a term, the repayment period; a function, determined by what it's used for. The instrument itself is neutral. What determines its effect is what it's attached to. A hammer isn't good or bad. It builds or it damages, depending on what it's used on and how it's used. Debt works the same way. The same instrument, at the same rate, with the same terms, produces completely different financial outcomes depending on its function. This distinction is obscured by how debt is culturally framed. In most financial conversations, especially in mainstream personal finance content, debt is presented as something to be eliminated. All debt, as fast as possible, regardless of its function or its cost. And for a specific category of debt, high-interest consumer debt, that's reasonable guidance. But applied universally, to all debt without examining its function, that framing produces decisions that are structurally wrong. The person who pays off a 3% mortgage instead of investing in an asset generating 7% because they've been told debt is bad is making a structurally incorrect decision that costs them real money over time. Not because debt is good, because the function of that debt and its cost relative to the alternatives makes carrying it the better financial choice. Understanding debt as an instrument requires separating two questions that most people conflate. Is this debt costing me money? And is this debt the best use of the financial capacity it represents? The first question addresses the rate, the interest cost, the ongoing obligation of servicing the debt. The second question addresses the function. What is the debt funding? What does the thing it's funding produce? Is that production greater than the cost of the debt? A debt that costs 3% annually, attached to an asset that returns 7%, is not costing money. It's generating a net 4% on the spread between the cost and the return. The same debt, attached to a depreciating consumer purchase, is simply a cost. There's no return on the other side, just the obligation. The instrument is identical. The outcomes are opposite. One builds position, one extracts wealth. The difference isn't in the debt itself, it's in what the debt is doing, what it's attached to, what it's producing, what the relationship is between its cost and its function. That distinction between debt as a building instrument and debt as a consumption instrument is the foundation of understanding how debt actually works, and how the same thing can be the most useful financial tool available in one context and the most destructive one in another. Before this continues, if you felt seen instead of sold to, that's the entire point of Relentless Wealth. Like the video, subscribe. We're just getting started. Not all debt is the same. Not because the instrument differs, because the function does. And the function, what the debt is attached to, what it produces, whether that production exceeds its cost, is what determines whether debt builds or destroys financial position over time. Productive debt has a specific definition: Debt that funds something that generates a return greater than the cost of the debt itself. A mortgage on a rental property that generates net cash flow above the debt service cost? Productive debt. The property produces more than the debt costs to carry. A business loan that funds operations generating revenue with margins above the interest cost. Productive debt. The business produces more than the debt costs. A student loan that funds education leading to income substantially higher than it would have been without the credential. Potentially productive debt. If the income differential exceeds the debt cost over time. In each case, the debt is attached to something that produces a return, and the return exceeds the cost, which means the debt is net positive to the financial position. Destructive debt is structurally different. It funds things that don't produce returns, or that produce returns far below the cost of the debt. Credit card debt at 20% interest, carried to fund consumer spending? Destructive debt. The spending produced no return. The 20% compounds against the balance, extracting wealth with every passing month. A car loan on a vehicle that depreciates immediately? Destructive debt. The asset loses value faster than the debt is paid down. The net position worsens continuously until the loan is retired. Buy now, pay later arrangements for purchases that produced no lasting value? Destructive debt. The enjoyment of the purchase is front-loaded. The cost continues, with no return on the other side. The distinction isn't about the amount. A large, productive debt is structurally better than a small, destructive one. A $1 million mortgage on a property generating positive cash flow is a productive instrument, regardless of its size. A $500 credit card balance at 22% interest, carried month to month, is a destructive one. Small in absolute terms, but compounding against the holder at a rate that extracts meaningful wealth over time. The amount is less relevant than the function. The function determines whether the debt is working for the holder or against them. Most people carry both kinds simultaneously. Productive debt, a mortgage, a business loan, and destructive debt, credit card balances, consumer financing, at the same time. And the destructive debt operates continuously against the position, compounding interest against the holder, while the productive debt is generating returns on the other side. The net effect depends on the balance. How much destructive debt is being carried? At what rate? Against what productive returns? But the principle is consistent. Productive debt builds, destructive debt extracts, and the financial position is the sum of both, compounding in opposite directions simultaneously. The same debt instrument, same interest rate, same repayment term, same monthly obligation, produces completely different financial outcomes depending on what it's attached to. This isn't theoretical, it's mechanical, and seeing it clearly changes how every debt decision gets evaluated. Consider two people, same income, same debt amount, same interest rate. Person A uses the debt to fund a rental property. The property generates rent. The rent covers the debt service. Something is left over each month. The property appreciates over time. The equity builds. Person B uses the same debt to fund lifestyle consumption, a vehicle, furniture, experiences, things that produced value in the moment but generate no ongoing return. After 10 years, Person A has built a capital position. The debt is largely paid down. The asset has appreciated. The equity represents real wealth. Person B has no asset. The debt is retired, but nothing was built. The income that serviced the debt for a decade produced no lasting position. Same instrument, same cost, opposite outcomes. determined entirely by the function of the debt. The function also determines the psychological experience of debt. Productive debt, debt attached to something generating returns, doesn't feel the same as destructive debt. The mortgage on the rental property is serviced by the tenant's rent. The obligation is met by the asset's production. The holder isn't using their labor income to pay for something that's not producing. The credit card balance at high interest, carrying a purchase that produced no return, is serviced entirely by the holder's labor income. Every payment comes from earned money. No asset is producing the return that covers the cost. The psychological weight is different because the structural reality is different. One debt has something on the other side. The other is just a cost with nothing returning against it. Understanding this distinction changes the questions asked before taking on debt. Not, can I afford the payment? That question produces decisions that prioritize monthly cash flow over long-term financial position. The better questions are structural. What is this debt funding? Does that thing produce a return? Is the return greater than the cost of the debt? What is the net financial effect of this instrument over the term it will be carried? These questions produce different decisions. They evaluate the function, not just the payment, the long-term position, not just the short-term cash flow. And the decisions they produce are structurally sounder than the ones driven by whether the monthly payment fits the budget. The goal isn't to avoid debt. The goal is to understand what each debt is doing and whether it's doing something that builds position over time. Debt that builds position is worth carrying, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the balance feels large, even when the conventional advice says to pay it off. Debt that extracts wealth, that carries a high rate against a depreciating asset or a purchase that produced no return, is worth eliminating as fast as possible. Not because debt is bad, because that specific debt is doing the wrong thing, taking from the position rather than building it. The instrument is neutral. The function determines everything. Subscribe if this reframed something you've been thinking about differently. Like this if it shifted your perspective.